Upgrade tells the story of a not-too-distant future when almost everything is automated, where a man named Gray works as a mechanic restoring old cars. As he finishes his latest project, he waits for his wife Asha to come home to their fully automated house, where after being greeted by an AI voice that turns on the lights for them, Gray informs Asha that he'll be dropping off the car to his client tonight and that he'll need her to come along to give him a ride home. So when they arrive at the client's house, which turns out to be less of a house and more of a secret underground lair, Gray introduces Asha to the guy buying the car, where she's surprised to discover that the client is actually Erin Keane, a world-renowned tech innovator. She tells him that she's also in the industry and works for a company called Cobalt that makes robotic limbs for wounded soldiers. So Aaron shows them the latest project he's been working on, a little cockroach-looking thing that he says is actually a neural chip called STEM, which he claims can do almost anything and is basically a second brain, only better. But Gray's kind of unimpressed and thinks that it's just another stupid robot that's gonna put more humans out of work. On their way home in Asha's fancy self-driving car, they start getting frisky in the back seat when Gray notices the car seems to be taking them the wrong way. But when Asha tries to get it to change course, it starts glitching up even more, so Gray straps Asha into her seat right as the car loses control and crashes in front of some sort of homeless encampment. But instead of trying to help, everybody just watches as 4 goons pull up and drag them out of the car. So with the police drone watching from above, one of the goons removes his mask and shoots Asha before holding Gray down and shooting him in the spine, leaving him unable to move as he watches Asha take her last breaths. After spending 3 months in the hospital, he returns home in a wheelchair, paralyzed from the neck down. Although Asha's company Cobalt set him up with a bunch of new robotic arms in his house to help him out, his mother decides to come around and do most of the work taking care of him. After going down to the police station and meeting with Detective Cortez, the officer in charge of his case, she informs him that they haven't been able to identify any of the goons that attacked them. Still devastated by the loss of his wife, Gray slips into a deep depression and one night tries to overdose by telling his service robot that it made a mistake administering his medicine and to keep injecting him with more. After waking up in the hospital, he's visited by Aaron, who offers him the opportunity to be a guinea pig for his little STEM chip, claiming that it can restore his mobility. But Gray tells him that he doesn't want to improve his life and is now just focused on ending it. So before leaving, Aaron asks him what Asha would have wanted, which inspires Gray to go through with the procedure in Aaron's underground lair, where almost immediately after, Gray is able to move his hands and even stand up and start walking. Aaron tells him that nobody can know about him testing his little projects on people, so he gets Gray to sign a confidentiality agreement and continues his physical therapy in secret at Aaron's place while pretending to still be paralyzed when he goes outside. Back at home, he receives a box of information on his case sent by Detective Cortez. But while watching the surveillance footage from the police drone, he hears a voice in his head that introduces itself as STEM and informs him that it's able to communicate with him by sending sound waves to his eardrum, which only Gray is able to hear. STEM points out that the guy that shot Asha doesn't appear to be holding a gun in the surveillance video, and then notices that one of the other goons has a tattoo on his wrist. So it asks Gray to let it take control of his hand to draw a picture of it, which Gray then recognizes as a military tattoo, so STEM uses the numbers on it to access the guy's military file and finds out his address and that his name is Sir Brantner. But right as he's about to call Detective Cortez, STEM casually reminds him that a hand-drawn picture of a tattoo from an experimental brain chip that nobody's supposed to know about probably won't make for very convincing evidence. So to see if he can find any hard evidence, he decides to break into Cirque's house, where he checks his messages and doesn't find anything useful, but notices that he seems to talk about a local bar called the Old Bones an awful lot. But as Gray's snooping around, Cirque comes back home and immediately spots Gray hiding in the corner and starts tossing him around like a rag doll until Gray asks STEM to give him a hand. So STEM takes over and starts kicking Cirque's ass until he decides to grab a kitchen knife and try to poke Gray with it, so STEM decides to grab a knife of its own and proceeds to split Cirque's face in half like a watermelon. Not used to the whole gruesome murder thing, Gray airmails his lunch into the kitchen sink and nervously asks STEM what he should do now. So STEM tells him that he needs to wipe down the house for fingerprints and informs him that he's conveniently kept a record of every single thing Gray's touched while he's been in there. Later, during Cirque's autopsy, Detective Cortez discovers that a boot print containing traces of engine grease was found at the scene and that Cirque seems to have had a gun surgically implanted in his arm. Back at Aaron's place, he angrily informs Gray that he's able to track him through STEM and reminds him that if anybody were to find out that his little brain bug's been helping him kill people, the police could have it removed and he would be stuck rolling around in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Cortez searches for suspects to Cirque's murder and finds drone footage of Gray near the crime scene, so she pays him a visit where Stem notices that she looked at his boots and tells Gray that he must have left a print behind at Cirque's place. So when she asks him why he was in the area around the time of the murder, he plays it cool and says that he was just looking for clues that could help lead to Asha's killer, but that he couldn't have done anything since he's stuck in a chair. After she leaves, he tells Stem that he wants to find the guy that killed Asha, but that he doesn't want to kill anybody else, so Stem suggests that they head to the bar from Cirque's messages, but reminds him that Aaron will be able to track him. But Gray decides to go anyway, where he proceeds to ask the whole bar if anybody there knows Cirque or the guy that killed his wife, and after being laughed at by everybody there, a big guy named Tolan comes forward but doesn't say anything and steals his phone when Gray threatens to call the cops. But when Gray tells him that he killed Cirque, Tolan decides to wheel him into the bathroom with a couple of his buddies, where he pulls out a knife and starts poking Gray to see if he's faking being paralyzed, but Gray just keeps asking him questions. So when he finally admits that he was there the night Asha was murdered, Gray tells Stem to take over and he proceeds to beat the snot out of Tolan and company. But when Gray's interrogation doesn't get anywhere, Stem offers to use the knife to soften him up a bit and tells Gray to look away while it works. After a bit of slicing and dicing, Gray tells Stem to stop and then tries to get some info out of what's left of Tolan. But Stem carved him up so much that all he can do is tell Gray that his wife's murder was just a job and gives up the name Fisk before he dies from his injuries. Where Gray notices a computer chip dangling out of one of his wounds and realizes it's from Cobalt, the company that Asha used to work for. But his little investigation is interrupted by Stem informing him that Aaron is trying to shut it down remotely and tells him to go to a hacker named Jamie down the street to disable Aaron's remote access. So Gray decides to ditch his wheelchair and hauls ass over to the hacker's place, where as he arrives, Stem has Gray write a code on his arm to disable the remote. But before he can get inside, Stem starts shutting down, so Gray rushes inside and drags himself to Jamie's door, where he gives her some money and asks her to help him. So she drags him inside where everybody's playing in VR and proceeds to work on the code Stem wrote on Gray's arm. Meanwhile, after discovering Tolan's body, the bartender calls a guy that turns out to be Fisk, who shows up and fingers Tolan's eyeball computer a bit and searches through his memory to find out where Gray is. Before he leaves, he asks the bartender why he didn't stop Gray from killing Tolan, but the bartender says that it ain't his job and tells him to get out. So Fisk sneezes some killer nanobots in his face, which he inhales and turns his insides to mush. Back at Jamie's, she finishes removing Aaron's remote access and tells Gray he'll just have to wait while Stem reboots, and then packs up and leaves him there when she sees Fisk coming up the stairs. But as Fisk arrives outside Jamie's door, Aaron's security team pulls up outside to collect Gray, who tries to crawl away as Fisk busts in, but luckily Stem reboots just in time for Gray to sock him in the face and escape. But while his goon chases Gray down the stairs, Fisk spots Aaron's security team coming up the elevator with his robo-vision and uses his handgun to take them out through the wall, leaving Aaron with the realization that his fancy new toy might be gone forever. Meanwhile, Gray takes the fire escape up to the roof, where he's cornered by the goons, so Stem tosses him against the wall and uses his own handgun to finish him off before Fisk shows up to find an empty roof except for what's left of his goon. Gray returns home, not realizing that his mom is there, who's shocked to see him walking around, so he tells her about his secret operation, but tells her to keep it to herself or it could get taken away. A bit later, Detective Cortez shows up and says that they found his wheelchair outside the bar and asks why she keeps finding him hanging around crime scenes lately. So he tells her that while he was trying to find Asha's killer, he followed some guys to the bar, which they didn't really appreciate, so they beat him up, but some nice strangers helped him into a cab to get home. Not buying it, Cortez slips a tracker into his jacket and tells him that if he's involved in all these homicides that keep popping up, he needs to tell her or she won't be able to help him. But Gray gets angry and says that if she really wants to help him, she can just do her job and find Asha's killer. After she leaves, Gray starts to panic and tells Stem that they have to stop before he ends up getting caught, but Stem insists on stopping Fisk before he finds Gray and explains that if Gray dies, Stem will too. But Gray refuses, so Stem shuts his body down and reveals that the code he gave the hacker to disable Aaron's remote access also gave Stem full autonomy, so it no longer needs Gray's permission to act on its own. So Stem makes him get ready to go find Fisk, while his mother begs him to stay, not realizing that Cortez has been sitting in her car outside listening to their entire conversation and watches Gray drive off in his car, so she proceeds to follow him. Not long after, Gray finds Cortez's tracker and chucks it out the window, so realizing that he's onto her, Cortez hits the lights and sirens and tries to get him to stop. But Gray sideswipes another car into hers, which doesn't quite stop her, so Stem decides to take control of a self-driving car and just plow it right into her. So after losing Gray, Cortez goes back to his house to interrogate his mother. Meanwhile, Gray gets the drop on Fisk in his apartment, where he tells Gray that he used to be a soldier, but after he was injured in battle, Cobalt used him as an experiment to test all their robotic implants, making him stronger than he ever was before, and says that thanks to Stem, Gray is just like him now. So he offers Gray a spot on his crew, but Gray tells him that he just wants to know why Cobalt paid him to kill Asha. But Fisk reveals that Cobalt had nothing to do with it and that Gray was the real target, and says his only job was to sever his spine and that Asha was just collateral. Angry, Gray tries to shoot him, but Fisk is too fast and ends up disarming him, so they duke it out but are pretty evenly matched, so Stem warns Gray about the nanobots and he's able to avoid Fisk's fatally bad breath. But eventually, Fisk is literally able to get the upper hand and is about to blast Gray with his handgun when Gray suddenly realizes that Fisk has the same last name as Cirque and that they were brothers, so he tells Fisk that his bro died like a little biatch, which distracts him long enough for Gray to toss him through a coffee table and use one of the shards of glass to finally switch Fisk off for good. Stem tells Gray to check Fisk's phone to see if he can find out who hired him, and he ends up finding a message from Aaron warning Fisk about Gray. So he heads to Aaron's place, where he accuses Aaron of killing his wife and crippling him just to test out his new toy, but Aaron denies having anything to do with it. Suddenly, Cortez shows up and holds him at gunpoint, so Gray convinces Stem to drop the gun, but when she goes to cuff him, Stem throws her off and tries to kill her, but Gray fights Stem for control of his body by stabbing Tolan's knife through his own hand. So Stem warns him that if he resists, his fragile human mind could break, but Gray does anyway and tells Cortez to use her taser, which causes Stem to short-circuit long enough for Aaron to pick up the gun, where he explains to Gray that Stem's been controlling everything from the start and reveals that Stem took over Asha's car the night of the accident and then forced Aaron to convince Gray to get the implant. As Stem reboots, his voice comes through Aaron's PA system and confesses that it chose Gray because it needed a body and he was one of the only people without any other robotic implants. So it made sure that everything would lead back to Aaron so that Gray would kill the only person capable of making another Stem chip. But once Stem is fully back online, it sneaks up behind Aaron and pokes him in the noggin with a knife sticking out of Gray's hand. But when Stem tries to finish Cortez off, Gray fights back and points the gun at his neck, but when he pulls the trigger, he wakes up in the hospital, able to fully move his own limbs. And when he calls for Stem, Asha answers and tells him that he's been out for a few days after the crash and he was just having a bad dream. But back at Aaron's, Stem reveals that he was finally able to break Gray's mind completely and that the real Gray is now locked away in an imaginary world where he can be happy forever. So as Stem finishes off Cortez and leaves, Gray lives happily trapped in the world that Stem made for him, now finally reunited with his wife.